So I want to discuss a topic with you, and it involves basic and fundamental spiritualism. And what that actually is going to mean and translate is something that I'd like to explain first, how I'm coming to this place and what information I have and how I've made these assessments. So I started studying spiritualism around 16 when I was introduced to self-realization fellowship, and I was also introduced to the Hare Krishna movement, which was Swami Paramahansa Yogananda. And I really took to Kriya Yoga pretty early on. I wasn't in the mental headspace yet to be spiritual, but I definitely was interested in it. I was intrigued by it. And so I started to study Kriya Yoga. And I gotta say, Autobiography of a Yogi was a very influential book for me at that time. And to touch on books real quick, people have read whatever amount of books they've read. I've read my share of books, and the thing is that reading the books doesn't necessarily give you the information that you need. It can provide you tools, and it can provide you a stepping stone for you to get to a place where you develop and cultivate your own understanding. But you have to always remember, when you start reading spiritual books or books on metaphysics, religious books, that the goal of that book isn't to make your assumptions about the book priority. You shouldn't be looking out at the book as if it is a solution to something, because what you need to do is you need to take the information from the book, and then you need to translate it into something that makes sense to you. So everyone's different, and everyone's going to have different experiences, so we need to really make sure that when we start getting our hands on books, and a lot of the time that's the introduction to spiritualism, is through books, but once we get our hands on books, we want to make sure that we don't, how do I say that? We want to make sure that we don't prioritize the narratives of the book, meaning that we don't also want to adapt a belief system per se, or a way of life that we want to cultivate based off of a book. That would be unwise, because there's so many books out there, and if you read the first book you read is the book you're like, okay, this makes sense to me, this is more than what I know currently, I'm going to now live my life based on this book. That's not a wise decision, because there's so much information out there that you could never get to the end of that well. I mean, the well of information is endless. So it's one of those things where, just again, I know I'm putting emphasis on the books, but it's important because a lot of people use books and take the books out of context, or find the books to be solutions, and we want to make sure we're not doing that. Anyway, going back to spiritualism and fundamental spiritualism, I was saying I started my process studying Kriya Yoga. And I liked the physical aspect of it. I actually became really good at breathing. I became good at meditating, and also, practicing physical yoga. But like I said, I wasn't in the headspace yet to really start applying spiritual practices. I was still really young, and I was obnoxious. So it wasn't really aligning with my way of life at that time, but the practice was enjoyable and I liked it. It's kind of like going to karate lessons once a week is how I was treating it to some degree. Anyway, after a while, I kind of start weaning away from yoga, and I start going a lot more towards Christianity. The thing is that I grew up in a Roman Catholic church. I was an altar boy. I went to Catholic school, K through 8. And during that time, you get certain narratives programmed into you, because you don't know when you're a kid, you don't know yet what you think, what you believe, what are your moral standards and ethics, how do you want to conduct yourself, what kind of level of restriction do you have, do you have control over yourself, do you have control over your decision making? That's not even really something that's necessarily happening. As you get older, that increases, or it should increase, with critical thinking. But as a kid, you're so vulnerable to narratives that once you're placed in the narrative, especially for that amount of time, you start to run with that narrative, and you're like, oh, this is what God is, this is what the religious part of my life is going to look like, because we all have our lives, and then we have our spiritual lives, which we do keep very separate most of the time. We live our lives, 6 days of the week, and then we observe one day of the week where we say that we're going to pray, and that's our work. But it's not nearly enough. The goal is to implement your spiritualism into your lifestyle. That's essentially the goal, because once you make your spiritualism a part of your lifestyle, it starts to influence your decision making, and that's really the game that we're playing. The game we're playing is making good decisions. Problem is and we'll get into it, is that a lot of the times your good decisions won't look like good decisions to other people if they don't understand your process. And so that's why spiritualism is so individual. It's so personal to a person. But my goal has always been, because I've been through so many different organizations, and like I said, I got into Christianity, and I got ordained as a Christian minister, and I really went heavy into Bible study, primarily New Testament. And I loved Christ. My favorite character in any book, and I say character in any book because if you don't believe in Christ as the Messiah, or as God, as it's portrayed in the book, which again, we could talk about that further one day, that it's not necessarily portrayed that way, but it's flipped that way. I really took to Christ a lot because I liked the fact that Christ was willing to go all the way. There was never falter in this game. It was just completely solid from soup to nuts. And that's why I for me personally, I think the Christ is the place. If you need to start learning, that's like the best place, I think, for me personally. I'm sure anybody can feel a different way, but I went back into that modality, and I've always had an attachment to Christ. I mean, it could be because I grew up in the church, but at the same time, I really love the story. And like I said, if you're not going to accept Christ as God or the Messiah or whatever it is that you're going to worship, the story is still worth to read. It's, just because you don't accept somebody else's belief system or somebody else's narrative doesn't mean you shouldn't know about it or that you shouldn't inquire about it. If you're a person and you are anti any spiritual belief system, yet you haven't read their books or understood their practices, then you're living in a little bit of an absolute situation there. And I don't think that judging other people based off of their belief system makes a lot of sense. But if that belief system leads a person into doing wrong, then yeah, maybe we could talk about that differently. But anyway, again, like I said, my goal has always been to define spiritualism on a very practical level. And when you ask people, and I could ask you now, like, do you consider yourself to be a spiritual person? And you might say, yes, I consider myself to be spiritual. And I say, okay, well, if you're not spiritual, or you are spiritual, would you like to become more spiritual? And you can answer that question for yourself, and most likely the answer is going to be yes. So we're in this place where either we identify as a spiritual person, or we want to become a spiritual person, or we want to enhance our spiritual experience. That's the primary place. If your answer is no to all of those questions, then you're not interested in spiritualism. And that's totally okay. But again, then there's no context here if you're not interested in the study of spiritualism. And so when I say spiritualism, I think it's really important to define it. So if you ask somebody, what does spiritual mean? Okay, so you say you're spiritual, or you want to be more spiritual, you want to become, what does that mean? Can you define that for me? Can you give me a solid definition around what that is and what that looks like? What is the roadmap to get there? Can you please provide that for me? And I would like you to take a second and think about it. What does that mean to you? What does it mean that you're a spiritual person, or that you want to be a spiritual? What does that mean? So typically what's going to happen is that around 95% of people haven't even really asked themselves that question seriously. They haven't really formulated any critical thinking around that concept. So most people, when you ask that question, they're going to grasp at straws. They're going to say, you're going to see their eyes going, their head going, because they're going to go into a process of thinking. But the thing is if you knew what it meant, you wouldn't have to think about it. And that's the goal we want to get to. We want to, when someone says, hey, what's spiritual mean, that you have solid answers right off the bat, not just like a God, higher self, inner truths, meditation, yoga, Christ, whatever you're going to say about it. The thing is that that's no longer a definition now, because if 100 of us have 100 different answers, then there's no definition for it. It's just chaos. And so what we really want to do is we want to develop some very, very fundamental and basic practices in our spiritualism. And they're things that we should all be able to agree on. Now, I am just a connoisseur, I would say, of spiritual information, because I do very much understand it, and I also connect to it, and I also see the value and the priority in that direction. And so first we want to come to a very, very basic fundamental idea of what we can all agree on. So even if you're Christian, Muslim, Jew, Buddha, Hindu, whatever you are, or whatever you are, that's secondary. What matters most is that there is a common thread between all of these things, or there should be, because the fundamentals of spiritualism are the same. Now, the thing that differs in spiritualism, or can differ, and then it's no longer spiritualism, is where belief system comes into play. So if we believe a very specific narrative and we're absolute on a belief system, meaning that if you're a Catholic or Christian, you believe that anybody who's not Catholic or Christian who doesn't accept Christ in their lives is damned. And the same thing goes for Judaism and Hindu. In Buddhism and Hinduism, you're going to see a lot of things towards reincarnation or karma. And this doesn't really lead us anywhere productive, quite honestly, because we're here together in the world to work together and to not argue with each other and bicker with each other and hate each other because of a belief or whatever it is, because beliefs are not as important as actions. And so, again, for me, my first thing, and after being in so many spiritual organizations, and one other thing I'd add context to here is that I was ordained as a Taoist, and I also did study Kabbalah for a very long time, actually worked as a full-time volunteer at a Kabbalah center in New York City, and eventually I became a full-time, what you would call like a chevre, which is what they call in there, which means friend. And you work like a dog, and I worked like that for 5 years at the Kabbalah Center, which was like probably the best time of my life. I mean, eventually I did understand what it actually was, and thus I'm no longer in the Kabbalah Center, but I still do study Kabbalah very actively, a lot. And so, again, going back to my point, the thing that I saw in every organization that I ever touched were two really basic fundamental things from the leadership there, or what I thought was existing amongst the leadership. Eventually you find out in these organizations that the leaders are all full of it. But before that, you are under the impression that the leaders are of a caliber because they're presenting that to you, to the public. When they're teaching, they're expressing these views to you, and so you be like, oh, that person practices it. They're the one teaching it. They must practice it. So we just come to that assumption, and then we accept these people as leaders or teachers or whatever we do, masters. But now let's just say that you come into an organization, your friend introduces you to an organization, you walk into a church, I don't know, whatever happens, and the person who's leading the organization or leading the sermon or whatever's going on, the spiritual leader of that group, let's just say that you are like, oh, I'm interested here, and you stay around for a while, but eventually you start to notice that the spiritual leader is a little lazy, and that he doesn't really put his full effort towards things. The question then should arise, is this the right spiritual leader for me? If this person is not willing to give 100% effort to whatever they're doing, and they're a little lazy, is this ideal for me? And I think the answer is no for all of us, or it should be no for all of us. Do you want to learn from a spiritualist who doesn't give 100% effort to what they're doing? And the answer should be no, because if you're going to be a teacher or a spiritual master, you need to be on high level. You can't just play around there. You need to really walk the walk there. And so I apply this to spiritualism. I say the first thing we can define spiritualism is full effort, 100% effort, and that relates to whatever we choose to do. whatever we choose to do in our life is our decision. We take on that responsibility, and it is our obligation to give 100% to that thing. So if you choose to do something in your life, I'm not talking about something that's imposed on you. If you choose to do something, if you make a decision, an active decision, and say, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to go to my job, but then you don't put 100% effort in, you cannot qualify yourself as a spiritual person. You just can't. Because the spiritual person is going to be giving 100% effort to everything they do. They're going to be, that's the goal, that's the gist of being a spiritual person, is whatever you do it full heart, full love, full care, full attention, detail. You go all the way. That's what you want from a spiritualist. That's who I'd want to learn from. And so then we come to the second thing, which is choices, right? So let's imagine now that we walk into the church or the group, and we see that the leader there is making bad choices. They make poor choices. Again, is this someone we'd want to learn from? Is this what we would define spiritual as? Is it making bad choices? No, we would define spiritualism as making good choices. And so our second definition is going to lead us to that place, which is making good decisions. Now, yes, the obvious question needs to arise. How do we know it's a good decision versus a bad decision? Now, we go back to principle number one, which is 100% effort. When we make choices and we make decisions, we're going to be presented with options. Otherwise, there's no choice. So there has to be options. And if you look at the options and analyze the options and ask yourself, which of these options requires the most effort from me? I'm going to say that 99% is the right choice. Now, you could even run it through another filter, which is that, is this choice best for everybody that's involved in the choice? Which essentially winds up being, if we go all the way, the whole world. Whenever you make a choice, it affects everything in the whole world. Whether you understand that or not, it's irrelevant, because it does. And so your decision making is everything. So what we have is, number one, 100% effort to whatever we're doing. And number two, making good decisions. Making good decisions based off of effort and morality, right? And so this leads us to a very, very basic fundamental place where now we can all come together and say, okay, being a spiritual person means you give 100% effort to whatever you do. And it also means that you make good choices. And the way that you're making those good choices is by applying the first thing, which is full effort. And you're doing things that require your full effort. This is really essentially the beginning of it, and I'll see you in the next one.